Welcome to the Subjective Professor Podcast, episode 11. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the racial implications of the collectivism versus the individual debate. Keeping in line with everything that we've said so far, the definitions that we're going to strive to use are going to be as broad and encompassing of all the various subjective opinions about any construct that we discuss. And this is so that we don't give an arbitrary advantage to any one individual or a group of people by having a less than favorable definition. So keep in mind that even though we have all of these broad definitions, we're starting with broad definitions, it's very easy to narrow our focus to a smaller group of people by simply supplying qualifiers, by adding adjectives to the construct that we're going to be discussing. So race, the concept that we are using and talking about, race, the definition that I've supplied to you already is a generalization or a categorization using a observable trait. And we can generalize and categorize people, ideas, concepts, places, all manner of things. Anything that can be generalized can also therefore be racialized. It's basically the same operation. It's the same function. Keep in mind that a race is generally a collective understanding of a diverse, numerous group of people. And no two people in that group are really the same. They just share this one physical trait that qualifies them to be included in that racialization. So when people talk about the collective versus the individual, what they're talking about is groupthink versus the individual, right? Often expressed as socialism versus freedom, society versus the individual, public versus private. And so the group has the priority. The group decides what must be done, what must be believed, what the value of things should be. But which group and how are they going to enforce their decisions? And cut to the chase, it's the majority that decides. The majority is the group that should be paid attention, and they use government. So government is the means by which the majority are now going to impose their will on everybody else, especially the people who disagree. And we should remember that all government is a monopoly of force. Only the government can force other people legally to do things they do not want to do. So the whole process of raising awareness is basically creating a racialization along the lines of a political issue. So if you want to talk about recycling, then you got the pro-recyclers and the anti-recyclers, right? Those who believe what it is that you're saying, what you're going for, what your goal is, and those who do not go along with it, right? And so any issue that you talk about, you actually also create a kind of racialization. And when the awareness reaches a certain level of people, in other words, if you get enough people thinking about that topic and thinking in the way that you want them to think, well, then you pass legislation or regulation is passed to dictate the right way of doing things. And as we said before, if you decide what is good, then at the same time, you're deciding what is bad. So on the one hand, you're basically telling everyone what the right way of doing things are, but at the same time, you are identifying who the criminals are. So if we keep in mind the two-colored piece of paper that I went over in episode 00, there are some people that no matter what it is that you say, because they are unmoved from their perspective, they won't go along with anything that you say, right? They will be stubborn in their subjectivity. And this is quite normal. It's not surprising. It's not indicative of anything evil or nefarious. That's just the way people are. We don't change our perspective unless there is a need to. Some people will change their perspective because it's now illegal. But most people, even if it is illegal, they'll just keep things on the down low and try to avoid any kind of attention from particularly law enforcement. So this process of the majority deciding what is right and what is wrong, this process reduces choices. And in a way, it determines morality by majority rule. You know, whether or not it actually is good, right or wrong, it's besides the point, right? No one really cares. Majority rules, this is the way it's going to be done now. All of these other subjectivities, all of the other choices that people want to make, they're illegal. You can't do it anymore, so don't even think about it. Whether that was in fact the best choice or not, you can't even debate it anymore because it's now set in law. I guess some people will try to sue the government to try to get certain rules, stopped or overturned, but that's a very, very long and slow process. And while people are fighting it, the bureaucracy to support and enforce that new piece of legislation is steadily growing, right? Money is set aside for all of the committees and the organizations and the people they're going to hire to enforce that piece of regulation. So this is the name of the game. Politicized groups are going to use government to force everyone else to abide by their subjectivity, right? So everyone else's subjectivity really doesn't matter. And so literally legislating morality, turning their own subjective sense of right and wrong into law. And if you put it this way, it should be easy to see that it functions just like any traditionally understood state religion, right? And it's when religion and the state, the government, are the same, then the laws that are pronounced are coming from a religious tradition. Therefore, everybody else who belongs to another religion, a different religious tradition, well, they're automatically disadvantaged in that society. And so here we have the situation where everyone, nearly everyone who's engaged in politics, they're legislating morality. We should realize that when one wins, when one is victorious in their political activism, those people believe that the system is good. But when people lose, then the system is corrupt. It's very predictable in that way. But for this reason, politics, race, and religion are pretty much, they go hand in hand, right? So these days anyway, what you believe is true, using racialization, using a narrow subjective understanding of a phenomena, and then you're going to characterize and present this information in a certain way, and then you're going to use the voting process, the government, to enforce what you believe is the right way of doing things. We talked about religion in episode 7. You can review that if you want. So raising awareness about a racialization is for political power and privilege to determine what is right and what is wrong. You can see political platforms operating with this understanding, right? They carefully word their political platforms during political campaigns to put together and bring together a coalition of voters who value various issues. And you're going to present them in such a way that they seem like they're all part of the same subjectivity, but really they're not, right? And so information production, knowledge production, the creation of information based on a certain subjectivity, that becomes really important here. So marketing, humanities PhDs, this is where they really make, well, this is their bread and butter, right? They're creating information based on a narrow subjectivity and basically telling everyone this is the way they should see the world. Now, this whole process is fine if you're part of the majority, right? If you are part of the larger voting bloc, then life is good. Winning the election or winning and getting your regulations passed means that your perspective is a matter of fact. It is law now. It's a fact. And so everyone else is just simply a sore loser. Any problems that arise, any anger, any like unemployment or oppression, violence, any of this kind of stuff, completely unrelated to that awesome piece of regulation that you just helped pass. You know, it's as if coercion or using force, right, with threat of violence has no unintended consequences, right? There are no unexpected results. And this is a lot like those childish science experiments that we did when we were in school, where you can change one variable and everything else stays the same, right? Well, that's what a law is. You know, you're just changing one variable and nothing else changes, which is so out of touch with reality, right? It ignores human action. It ignores the ability of people on the fly, right, as things are changing, to make adjustments, which means it never, any legislation, any regulation, it rarely turns out in the way that people expected. I'll give you an example. Prohibition, alcohol prohibition, drug prohibition, it doesn't really matter. Any kind of prohibition will end in tears. Alcohol prohibition failed because people realized that they can make a lot of money by bootlegging, by creating, producing, and distributing alcohol illegally. And because there's so much money there, more and more of society becomes corrupted. You got law enforcement on the take that is taking bribes so that they look out the other way when alcohol is being bought and sold. And so you have the spreading of corruption in this way. Drug prohibition, we can see that no matter how hard and strict the drug laws become, people don't change their behavior. Rather, you just simply create a larger class of criminals, right? So coercion always fails. We talked about this before. And legislation of morality doesn't make society better. You're just simply creating more lawbreakers. And at the same time, we're going to see this later, making society, life in society, much more difficult. Now, that's pretty bad as it is. But one thing that we have to also remember is that in all of this legislation of morality, it's always bad news for the minority, right? So if you have majority rules, there's always going to be a minority that lost, that are going to lose. And just to keep things simple, you know, I just want to point out that race-based political activism started out to protect the minority against the majority, against the power of a coercive government, right? So race-based activism sought to protect the minority. But if you listen carefully now, the people who claim to be race-based activists are all about democracy, right? They're all about majority rules. And so somehow, somewhere in there, the minority has become the losers again. And full disclosure, I always find myself a minority, right? I don't agree with the majority opinion of most things. Some things I do cave and I say, yes, chocolate is great. But in most cases, I kind of go the other way. In other words, I don't go along with the majority. And so I find myself always upset with any election, with any political decision, with any new knowledge production regarding some new trendy, moralistic vision of society. You know, I don't like it. I don't like 99% of it. And in this whole process, people are so excited about having the ability to be politically active, right? Doing all the trendy things that hippies made so popular in the 1960s. Well, what most people overlook are the class of people, the racialization of people who benefit the most all of the time. And that would be the politicians and the unelected bureaucrats who work for the government. An example would be the sugar tax. It was marketed as being something that will benefit young children, right? The revenue that's raised through the sugar tax, and it is a tax, will go towards early childhood education. So who would vote against early childhood education? You know what I'm saying? So most people were convinced that, well, sugar is bad for you anyway. We do have an obesity problem. So sure, I can vote for that. And besides, the kids are going to benefit, and they need all the help they can get. Well, it turns out that less than 20%, I think less than 15%, in fact, of the sugar tax revenue, at least in Philadelphia, uh, you know, went to children, right? Early education programs, etc. But the lion's share, like over 80% of the money revenue that was raised, went to government, right? They needed money for their pension fund, right? Because a few years back, at least in Philadelphia, the pension fund was short $4 billion. Well, this is the retirement money for all these politicians, and they want a cushy retirement, so they're going to make sure that there's enough funding for their pension plans, right? And so you have all of these people who have to pay the tax, and the people who actually benefit, in spite of all the knowledge production surrounding it, are the political class. The alternative for all this legislation of morality is to let people live according to their own subjectivity and leave everyone else alone. It's more likely that if we engage in the legislation of morality, we will have many bad outcomes. State religion is a lesson that everyone should relearn. But that's it for this episode. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the individual. I'll see you there.